I've been contacted by a number of different educators and educational institutions lately about PowerPoint presentations. Specifically, educators are asking us as designers what advice we would give their students about making a great presentation. So I put together a presentation today called Making an A-plus PowerPoint Presentation. My name is Mark, and I own Ablaze Media, and this is some advice from a designer to students specifically and how they can make their PowerPoint presentations really look sharp. Check this out. So the first principle is to write first. Now, believe it or not, even in a professional environment, we start with an outline, and we outline what we're going to say. And then the next step, we fill in the outline, and we know exactly what we're going to say and how we're going to say it. And then thirdly, after we're done doing all the writing, then we make the slides. So the principle number one is to plan first and then make the presentation. A great presentation begins with great information. If you want to get a good grade, you have to present excellent content and then use your slides to reinforce excellent content. Writing well takes time, and spend your time writing well. Start with your paper and then make your slides. Don't try to make your slides first. Now, sometimes designers are tempted to do that because we get excited about the graphics. Don't make your slides first. Write your information first and then use your slides as a supplement. The second principle is to use really great readable fonts. Now there's two different kinds of fonts. The first kind of font is a serif font, and the second kind is a sans serif. So I'm going to click on my pen here. A serif font has the little feet on it, and a sans serif font has no feet on it. Now these little feet, they help your eye to track across a paragraph. That's what they're intended for. But we find that in PowerPoint presentations specifically, a sans serif font that doesn't have the little hooks, the little feet on it, are just more readable from a distance. At fonts.google.com, there's two fonts that we really like and we use a lot around Ablaze Media. One is called Nunito Sans, and the other is called READABLE. We think those are excellent alternatives to Arial, but if your teacher requires you to use Arial or Times New Roman, for sure use that, but we really feel like these are superior alternatives to an Arial font. We would suggest that you don't use decorative fonts for more than a word or two on a slide. A decorative font would be like a cursive font, something like Pacifico or Vivaldi, or something that has a lot of curves and twists. It's really fancy. If you do more than a word or two on a slide in a fancy font like that, it really becomes very difficult to read. Don't use ever in graphic design to use more than 3 fonts. Typically, the rule for graphic designers is that you have a title font that's typically a sans serif. You have a paragraph font that's typically a serif. And then you have a decorative font of some kind that's just used for little splashes. On PowerPoint slides, you generally want to use one font family. So like, for example, if you use Roboto, you could use Roboto for the entire presentation, and it's going to look fantastic. Third principle is limit your verbiage. Okay, so a few things here. Yes, you're using too much text on your slides. I guarantee you that you are. So let me talk about a few best practices as far as how much information you should put on a slide. Titles, that's the text up top. The title should be 7 words or less, generally speaking, okay? Secondly, try to keep your bullets under 10 words. Don't write a whole paragraph. Don't write your whole paper on the slide. The slides are only made to reinforce what you're saying, not to say everything that you're trying to say. Never do just one bullet, okay? If you have a bullet list, have at least 2 bullets in the bullet list, all right? And then try not to go any more than 5. I mean, 5 isn't a hard rule, but that's a good rule of thumb. I mean, 3 to 5 bullets in a bullet list is really a good practice. Finally, don't read from your slides. Present to your people, present to your audience. Don't present back to your computer. The computer sits behind you and it's reinforcing what you're saying, but it isn't something you should turn to and try to present from. All right, the next principle is to use your photos properly. There's a couple of pet peeves that designers have when they see presentations, so let me talk about a few of those. First off, you should use a picture. You should use 1 picture per slide. If you don't use any pictures, it's a missed opportunity. Pictures really help to communicate and reinforce what you're trying to say. However, loading up the slide full of pictures and clip art can really be distracting and can be very unhelpful to your presentation. So if you have 2 or more pictures on your presentation, you need to have a good reason for doing that. Even on this slide, I have 4 pictures on here, but as you'll see, I have a reason for having those 4 pictures. Search for large, high-quality photos, or you're liable to get a picture like this top one here, this bird, where it's all pixelated. And that's very unprofessional to use pixelated photos. You want to look at a place like Pexels.com. Pexels.com is a totally free resource that has high-quality photos that you can download and use in your presentations. Next, use photos without watermarks. Watermarks are these little white pieces of text and pieces of clip art. Sometimes there's these little lines go across. Well, that's telling you that you don't own that photo. That belongs to somebody else, and it's very unprofessional to use photos with watermarks on them. Lastly, don't smush or squeeze or distort the images. Obviously, this picture of a tennis ball, well, it should be round. And unless you have a reason for making it look unround, keep it round. Take the picture and resize it in proportion to itself, and then crop off the pieces that you don't want to use instead of trying to squeeze it and distort it in order to fit it into a space. Principle number 5, make sure that your slides are readable and are contrasting. First of all, a 16-point font or larger is generally the best practice for PowerPoint slides. Anything smaller than 16 points is just too small. Next principle is that light writing, even white writing on a dark background is best. Light background, like a white or a yellow background, a red background that you have to look at for a whole presentation, can be really tiring for your audience to look at. A busy background, like this top example here, you could hardly read the text because the background's so busy we're losing the text in the background. It's illegible. So make sure that the colors that you use are high contrasting colors and not colors that tend to blend into each other and are difficult to read. 6th principle is to understand that colors communicate. So without going into a lot of color theory, let me just touch on a couple of things that students need to know first and foremost. First of all, the best colors for a school presentation are these 4 colors. Blue communicates trust. That's why you often see banks using blue. They often don't use green, which you would think they would use because that would communicate money. But blue communicates that they're trustworthy. Very often that large corporations use blue because they want to communicate that they're going to be reliable. Green communicates growth. That's great for like your science projects, for environmental projects, for anything that is about making things grow and be nurtured. Black and gray are they communicate that it's formal, it's solid, it's masculine, it's not going to go away, it's assertive, and so black and gray are really helpful in those kind of presentations. And lastly, brown communicates either something historic or something earthy. So they're great for history presentations, or if you have like an earth science presentation, or you want to talk about coffee growing or something organic. Those are really helpful colors. Only use a few matching colors. As designers, when we're putting together a print piece or a website, we typically have a color palette of only a handful of colors that all go together with each other, and we limit ourselves to a couple of main colors and a couple of accent colors. For a PowerPoint presentation, you should really limit yourself to just a couple of colors outside of your pictures. Principle number 7, I just want to touch on the power of infographics. If you have a complicated thing you're trying to communicate, sometimes a graph or a chart can really help communicate that well. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, an infographic is worth like 10,000 words. It just really helps your audience to wrap their mind around a difficult concept. And that's this next point. It helps communicate complex ideas clearly. An infographic can include anything from charts to graphs to diagrams. Principle number 8, don't overdo it. Okay, a little bit goes a long way when it comes to effects on fonts or effects on clip art. Just because you can put an effect on something doesn't mean that you should put an effect on it. I remember when I first discovered all the neat effects that I could do inside of PowerPoint on the text. And it was exciting to me to see all these cool things. You could, make it swirly and make it contoured and whatnot. But if you put a bunch of effects on a bunch of words all over your presentation, it just looks busy and it ends up losing its impact. A splash here and a splash there is more than enough. Use one effect at a time, or use one animation at a time. If you like an animation that slides in from the side, use the animation that slides in from the side every time. If you want to make them just fade in, use a fade in on the whole thing. Don't think about having it slide in one time, then having a bunch of pixels come in the next time, and having curtains come down the next time. Just keep things simple and keep them uniform, and that helps your presentation to look more professional. You should practice before you present. Sometimes there's technical problems you can avoid when you go through the slides ahead of time. Sometimes you got something in your head, but you don't totally know how to communicate it. And you can really communicate your information much better when you have a chance to rehearse it ahead of time. Well, I hope that's helpful. And those are a few tips that designers would have for putting together your PowerPoint presentations.